Welcome to Cues and Views, first on the web for collecting English billiard cues. Welcome again to our latest programme in the Cues and Views collection of videos. Once again, I'm fortunate to be spending some time with Dominic Dale, and I can't resist the opportunity to converse with Dominic about one of my personal passions in cue collecting terms, and that's the almost legendary company of Burroughes and Watts. A company based in London, started in 1836 and which carried on right up until, in production, definitely 1967, and as a company possibly into 1968. So good afternoon, Dominic. Nice to see you again.
Yes, absolutely.
I think, like me and like a lot of people, you have an admiration for the cues and the range that Burroughes and Watts put out. I mean, I know they also made billiard tables, and the company also sponsored matches and promoted matches and supported even individual snooker players, and have snooker players possibly managed those snooker players. I'm not quite sure about that, but they certainly had strong connections with Leicester Square Hall and all that, and they're an absolutely legendary company, aren't they?
Absolutely. They certainly had Willie Smith under their management for quite a number of years, and I think there was certain things relating to Burroughes and Watts' contracts was possibly the reasons why Willie didn't actually enter the World Billiards Championships more than twice that he did. But absolutely what you say, probably the most recognised major brand in the history of billiards and snooker and memorabilia, I feel, even though they're not the oldest company who are still going, Thurston's, but certainly the most recognised, I feel.
I mean, Thurston started out in 1799 as a cabinet maker, and they went over to solely billiards productions about 12-15 years later. Burroughes and Watts, as far as I understand, have some links going back to Thurston's, but as we say, became the premier company that everybody knows, everybody remembers, and the memorabilia that you can get that's associated with Burroughes and Watts always fetches a decent price in the antique market and so on. And of course, going back to the range, and another player that was very much associated with Burroughes and Watts was Sidney Smith, totally different Smith, no relation to the gentleman you mentioned, and the cue that bears his name, which often has bird's eye maple facing splice and a black and green veneer, I think every bit as desirable in some ways as a cue as the famous Burroughes Watts champion cue, but never quite fetches the same kind of money when they're sold at auction, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's a good point you make. Maybe it's because it's got a name player, Sidney Smith, on the nameplate. Burroughes Watts champion just sounds great. It's from the house of themselves, Burroughes and Watts. It's obviously a shortened version of both words, but and designed by their own craftsmen as well. And I think that the Burroughes Watts champion actually, it was patented in I think 1895, 1896, but no one's really ever seen one of that period, have they, with an ivory badge?
Andy Hunter says that he has a memory of when he was first cue collecting that he did come across an ivory badge Burroughes Watts champion, I think. That akin to his memories of a Lindrum cue with an ivory badge on as well, a 1929 Walter Lindrum cue. He says he can remember with an ivory badge, and he says he thinks he remembers seeing one. I don't know if he's ever mentioned that to you.
I'm a bit surprised, because if you take the Willie Smith champion cue that Burroughes and Watts produced, you can very rarely, but they do exist, and I've seen photographs, one or two on various internet sites somewhere, hard to find, but of an ivory badge Willie Smith champion cue. And it seems to me that cue was made around about the time when he won the World Billiards Championship for the second time in 1923. And it's an absolutely ideal point, a reference point to us as collectors, as to when ivory went out and composite materials, plastics and things came in. Because you can get the Willie Smith champion cue that couldn't have been made earlier than probably 1923, at some point, 1924. And then after that, they're always plastic badges, so it seems to me that Burroughes and Watts stopped using ivory in the mid-20s, and possibly other companies did too, but if Andy hadn't have seen an ivory badged Lindrum 1929, I'm surprised, to be honest.
Well, I have to say this, it's well documented that Billiards and Snooker Control Council, I think it was, stopped using ivory billiard balls in the World Championship in 1925. When did Walter Lindrum make the 1370 break? No, was that 1925?
That was Tom Newman.
Sorry, what did I say?
Walter Lindrum.
Yeah, Tom Newman made that break in, I believe, 1925.
1924, I believe it was.
Right, okay. So again, that was the last year, wasn't it, that they used ivory billiard balls in the championship, or it was the year after. So they stopped using ivory billiard balls, so as a useful material to be working with, it suggests strongly that they went fully over to composition round about that period. So I think your 23, 24, 25 is definitely in that era. Interestingly, when you go back into the history of the design of the Burroughes Watts champion, we have to go back to a slightly earlier era still, because as you touched on, the patents, I do believe it's 1896, but I could be wrong.
I think it is 96, 1896.
That era is very much in what we would call the billiard cue era. Snooker has not taken over by that time as the major, certainly the major professional competition, and therefore we see a lot of cues of that design with the flared butt, quite often quite light cues, 15.5, 16 ounces, 16.5 ounces, with the billiards taper to the shaft. And most of those cues from that era include John Roberts's, Joseph Bennett, that kind of thing, and of course Cecil Harverson cues. Now, if the Cecil Harverson isn't a predated kind of Burroughes champion in design, then I'm going to be amazed, because they were produced by Burroughes and Watts.
Yeah, absolutely, with the same type of timbers. Has a very short, stubby sort of front splice, big, thick satinwood veneer, and I think they are a Macassar ebony.
Yes, I have one that is definitely, and it's Macassar, yeah.
But were they ever just in jet black ebony? I can't remember.
Now, funnily enough, I have a second, what we call a second, we all call that everything's editions, because it helps us just sort it out in our own mind, what we've seen, and to remember them. I have a second edition. The difference between the two Harversons, as you'll know, is the first edition one, which is very billiards shape, has the signature on the ivory badge, which is where we came in with the discussion about ivory, and the facsimile signature on there, and above that, on the flat of the cue, the Burroughes and Watts stamp. Now, the second edition one is not quite so flared in the butt, much straighter butt, therefore much straighter badge, like what we call the first edition Burroughes champion badge, and it says the signature and Burroughes and Watts underneath. And that cue that I have has got a dark facing splice, as you say, satin wood veneer, very dark ebony butt, and the one I have isn't in the greatest possible condition, but the design of the cues are very easy to see, and it looks almost indistinguishable from a first edition. If you cover the badge with your hand, someone would say that's a Burroughes champion. When I say someone, maybe not me or you, but certainly someone who's never seen it before would say that's a Burroughes champion.
It seems the early Burroughes champions were always Macassar ebony, the main splicing, with a nice big thick satinwood veneer, and a lower splice. Well, it seems to alternate, so I've seen very early Burroughes champions with two different timbers for the front splice of like an Indian rosewood and something called leadwood, and that's, in me, those are they're very difficult to discern in terms of which is earlier than the other one. I think they're probably both made around about the same period, in the sort of very, very early 20s or late, or just after the First World War.
I mean, again, you see Reese cues, the same type of Macassar ebony. It helps with the fact that there were three different Reeses. The 1907, is it 1916 and 23, I think.
There's a 1907 Reese, there's a 1913 Reese, and a 1916.
Which helps a lot in terms of dating other cues, because the shape of those Reeses, again, I have a 1907 Reese, quite billiards shape. Again, Stevenson cues of the Burroughes and Watts type, not the Cox and Yemen. The Burroughes and Watts type Stevensons are slightly more snooker shape, although rarely heavy, so they are very much like a billiards taper and billiards shape cue, so they can't be much different. Again, ivory badges, nearly always ivory badges. And those cues have Macassar ebony butts, so clearly it was the wood of choice at the top end of the ranges that Burroughes were using at the time.
Interesting. I don't know how long Burroughes made the 1916 Reese for, because I've seen them with plastic badges many times.
Oh yes.
That's an interesting one, isn't it?
Well, yeah, because they're right in the heyday of using ivory. I mean, ivory is a very good material to use for making badges because it shines up really nicely, looks very attractive on the butt of a cue, and also a lot of the plastics that they were experimenting with at the time weren't that stable, weren't that easy to work with because the machinery wasn't really geared up for it. But it did change over once it changed over to plastic, it kind of never went back, obviously, for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But going back to the Burroughes and Watts range, obviously it's not all about the Burroughes Champion, although I have a soft spot for the Burroughes Champion. One of the cues I really like is and again there is a first and a second edition, is Mascot cues. I think they're quite a nice cue. What are your thoughts?
I like the Mascot cue because it's normally a jet black ebony butt, but with a nice sort of apple green veneer, and it looks very nice, a bit like an all-match cue, I suppose. But I think a lot of people out there don't understand that actually the first edition Mascot has a little emerald green circular badge, whereas the one we're more familiar with is the later square badge version with the green writing. Interestingly, the first edition Mascot cues tend to be very solid, playable cues for today, unlike sort of other cues that were made in our era, and I don't quite know why that is. But we've seen some very solid early Mascots that are stamped at 17 ounces and very snooker shaped and very sturdy specimens, and don't know why that is, because certainly those date from the 20s in my opinion.
Yes. Now, interestingly, Burroughes and Watts bought out Orm in the 30s, early 30s.
1932, yeah.
1932, exactly. Now, it's clear to me, I believe, and I've seen a photograph of a catalogue with a 1936 image of a Mascot with the round badge that you describe. It's quite obvious to me that the Mascot in that image, and I have a first edition Mascot like that, is descended from the on-match cue, as you said. Did you not used to use an on-match cue in your amateur days?
In my amateur days I had a maple on-match cue, yeah,
Right.
a trapezium-shaped badge. Lovely cue, it was a super cue. I mean, I was only young in those days. I'm sure it wasn't full length, it would have been about 56.5, 57 inches long, but I used it for quite a few years, before I later had a Riley Diamond cue.
Yeah, the green flash, as we call it, the thin green veneer above the ebony splice, it looks almost like it's been let into the full butt of the cue, but of course it's two splices. Trapezium, some people describe a trapezium shape as a square that looks like it's been pushed back a little bit at the top.
Yeah.
So it's quite a nice way of describing it.
Cross between a triangle and a square, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it's like the top cut off of a triangle.
Yeah.
Very nice design badge. Sometimes 2 screws, sometimes on the earlier ones, some of the early ones, no screws at all, glued in without any screws.
Yeah.
Nice looking badge. Nice wording, nice descriptive looking badge. Very attractive.
Yeah.
Going back to our friends Mr. Burroughes and Mr. Watts, one of the innovations, they liked the word Eureka. On new tables you see it, and on cushions, and a lot of their new innovations, they managed to incorporate the word Eureka, which obviously is sort of a scientific word, discovery word, and it's sort of word of the moment, really. And they designed a cue, as snooker became more popular than billiards, and they designed a cue in their range that was specifically designed, in their own words, for the stun, screw, the forcing shots that were required.
That's right.
In that game. And that cue, as we both know, was the Eureka.
Yeah.
How would you? What have you seen any good Eurekas in your
Many, yeah.
travels?
But funnily enough, I always find them too springy for today's snooker player. But they always advertise them as having fitted with the brass ferrule. A cue that came out in 1933. In ash, mainly, but you can get maple Eurekas certainly, same as you can with Burroughes Champions. It didn't really. This is the interesting thing. They always describe them as having a tulip wood butt. Macassar ebony with 4 lower splices of tulip wood. I've seen more Eurekas that aren't tulip wood than I have that are tulip wood. They've made the cue for quite a number of years, probably 20, 25 years. I think they made them. I don't know when they stopped making I don't know if they were still making Eurekas up until the time Riley's bought Burroughes out in 1967, as you said earlier. But certainly I have seen them with tulip wood. I've seen a lot with another reddish timber that doesn't have those streaks in it. A timber called Paurosa, which later Mannix were made from. It seems that a lot of the Burroughes and Watts range had the similar timbers in throughout, well, not throughout the range, but if cues were multi-spliced or had front splices, you'd see the same timbers cropping up from the same era in those cues. But, and then of course obviously the later Eurekas were just jet black ebony rather than the Macassar ebony front splices.
But with an additional butt of some more orangey or reddish colour.
Yeah, second four secondary splices. A very, very pretty cue. And a cue that often gets replicated today. It's another beautiful design of a cue.
It's a very classic design, isn't
Absolutely.
it? A lot of Burroughes designs they lifted them, they were colourful, they were interesting. It's almost as though whoever their designers were, they were a bit more creative, and they were very keen on bringing in exotic timbers, as you said earlier. I have a Tom Taylor cue that you might remember.
Yes.
With the bird's eye maple butt in machine splice.
Yeah.
With a facing splice of snakewood.
Absolutely.
Very rare cue.
Yeah, I mean, incredible. I managed to pick up a pair of those years ago from the same chap. I've never seen one since or before, but I mean, going back to Eureka, I mean, it's the badge, isn't it? I mean, it's a beautiful badge. Very interesting, sort of elongated trapezium, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, that's right.
With 4 screws, 2 at the top, 2 at the bottom, but a beautiful scrolly Eureka word.
Yes.
And then within a scroll, actually, are the words Burroughes and Watts. It's just a lovely, lovely cue, yeah.
And again, there's green, which just seems to be a colour that keeps coming back to the snooker world, you know, the green bays and so on. And there's green in the writing as well, which looks attractive.
Yeah.
The Eureka, designed, as I say, for the slimmer bud.
Yeah.
Than certainly than the early Burwood champions. In fact, I'd say throughout a slimmer butt than almost every Burwood champion you pick up. I've rarely picked. I mean, I have in my collection. I have a quite slim butted Burwood champion, which again is in the snooker era. It's one of the later ones. I've been lucky enough to come across the Burwood champion that I have that has a secondary plate with CR on it, which I'll show an illustration of this cue. I think we did find out, was it not from 1953? I think we found
1955.
55,
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I'll be having its birthday soon.
Yeah.
That's helpful to, when you find out some provenance like that, helps you date others, because I have a virtual twin to it, which must be mid-50s again.
Yeah.
And what was noticeable about those was that the badge on those later ones was very much more white in colour than many of the early Burwood champions, even though they're not ivory badged ones.
Yeah, a different form of plastic, probably less oil based, or well, I don't know, but it seems to me that the oil based plastics, the earlier plastics, which is basically cellulose nitrate, tend to have a more creamier colour to them. Certainly with age, the older they get. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, should we leave it there about Burroughes and Watts, or perhaps we ought to?
Well, I mean, if you think about the Burroughes and Watts range, I mean, we've spoken about the Eureka. Got to talk about the Mannix. That's probably.
I've forgotten about the Mannix.
Yeah, probably.
Not really. You can never forget the Mannix.
No, probably the most famous of all the Burroughes and Watts cues. Did cost more than any other cue because of the number of splicings. There's a lot more work going into it. It's not just 4 splices and an actual maple shaft. You have 4 machine splices in ebony, 4 lower splices, and then a front splice. So it's a very complicated cue. There's a lot more work goes into the production of a Mannix. Probably because of the length of the butt. I think you have about a 23-inch total butt section from the to the tip of the pointed ebony splices. So obviously originally the butt section has to be dowelled. You wouldn't machine splice in solid ebony 23 inches up the cue before applying the lower splices. So that's something that Burroughes and Watts would have done.
Interesting, the thing about the Mannix there is that a lot of people don't know whether to categorise them as a machine splice cue or a hand splice cue. It's difficult to say whether you would say, if you were being sort of cataloguing them, some people say, I've read this in advertisements, in auctions and so on, because the top part of the cue is machine spliced and the bottom part has a full hand splice butt, therefore it's difficult for people to categorise them.
Yeah.
you know, which is an interesting thing because in reality you also get them double hand spliced, very, very rare. But I actually have one that's double hand spliced.
You do, yeah.
Which is, you know, I've not seen many. I've seen replicas. And I do believe that you're interested in the type of materials that were often used in the construction of the cues that Burroughes were famous for. And you've seen Mannix in a variety of woods, especially, and all the top cues really, except with the exception of the Yale dash, of course.
Yeah, I think I've seen 7 different varieties of the Mannix cue. Goodness me, it's hard to go through them all one by one, but I think the earliest Mannix certainly was tulip wood lower splices. I mean, they all have pointed ebony machine splices.
Of course.
And then the earliest Mannix had 4 lower tulip wood splices, but the front splice of the early Mannix was actually a piece of unfigured by now snakewood.
Yes.
And here's the even more unusual thing. Burroughes and Watts always put their Burroughes and Watts logo, Burroughes and Watts London logo, stamped into the front splice below the nameplate.
Yes.
Now, even on snakewood, which is one of the world's hardest timbers, they did attempt to stamp that name. I have seen it on them,
Right.
but it's actually not sort of front on. So if you have the cue sort of here, it's not front on facing you, it's actually side on.
Yes.
And I have seen it. It's extremely hard to find because snakewood being so hard, and obviously the cue having such a great age to it, it's worn off by and large. But if you shine little lights on it, you can just see the Burroughes and Watts stamp there sometimes. Shorter badges as well.
Yes.
Because of course the Mannix cue was patented originally by John Patrick Mannix in 1891. Sold the patent, it seems, to Burroughes and Watts in about 1902, 1903. And Burroughes and Watts made the Mannix then, but and very much a billiard shape. I mean, the very, very big, thick butts, early Mannix. And then from the tulip wood, they kept using tulip wood. It was stated in the original patent by Mannix that they would be made of tulip wood or a similar material with a possible India rubber grip. I've never seen one, but I've seen Mannix that don't have an India rubber grip but look as though it once had that grip applied, where there are 2 sort of grooves top and bottom where it looks like you would have applied some sort of a rubber wrap around the butt section. Very interesting. But yeah, other variations of the Mannix, I've seen them with lower splices of Paduk,
Yes.
Burroughes, and one of my favourite timbers, Marblewood, which looks like a timber called Zebrano, but it's a very similar sort of straw colour, but has sort of a purpley brown sort of striations, a very zigzaggy grain, whereas Zebrano is more orderly. And they use that timber also for the hand splices of the Eureka cue, and for the front splices of certain editions of the Burroughes Champion as well.
Yes, they do.
It looks like tulip wood, but it's much browner.
Yes, it is.
Paduk is a much more reddish purple colour with very.
I have seen a Eureka with a full butt with Paduk as well. That was original.
You will have done, yeah, because they made Mannix as well.
Yeah.
It wouldn't just be the Mannix only. They obviously bought a stock of timber.
Absolutely.
And used it for other cues at the same time as well. Paduk is a reddish brown colour, but very porous grain. You can put your fingernail in the grain.
Yes.
Burroughes is for me the latest and last edition of both the Eureka and of the Mannix. In the case of the Mannix, the lower splices on all, as far as I'm concerned, the Burroughes edition, which is an orangey red colour, a very beautiful wood actually. It doesn't really have much of a visible grain in it.
No.
But the front splice of those is nearly always mahogany, with a longer badge. It's the last edition of the Mannix before they sold out to riders.
I do believe that my double hand splice Mannix is that latter end edition.
It is indeed, yeah. And as you say, a double hand splice Mannix, who would have ever thought that existed? But I've known of 2. One I owned, that you now have. And interesting, the hand splices. It seems to be a Macassar ebony, not a jet black ebony, which is interesting.
Well, I don't know whether that's some sort of design thing that relates again to the Eureka or whatever. Would it be worth clarifying what the anti-grip means on the butt? Because this is Jack Mannix's patent, and it does give some clues as to what and in his technical books, he was very keen to encourage his students as a coach not to grip the cue firmly. So the anti-grip is to do with the shape of the butt, so it encourages you not to grip the cue, and so you know exactly where your hand is on the butt of the cue.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing that Jack Mannix, or John Patrick Mannix, to use his name correctly, Jack was more of his nickname as a billiards tutor and very good player of billiards. He moved to France.
Hence the JP.
Hence the JP. Yeah, absolutely, John Patrick Mannix.
Yeah.
The design of his original patents in 1891 stipulated that the first 8 inches of the shaft from the ferrule down wouldn't taper, and the idea of that was because the Mannix was actually designed as a masse cue.
Yes.
So that when basically you had your bridge raised here and your cue down here, that as you in the act of striking the ball, the cue not being tapered, you'd still hit the same spot of the ball that you were originally aiming at in the course of making the
billiards
stroke.
players use delicate masses, don't they, to keep close control
All the time.
to keep the balls close together.
Yeah, because quite often when you play billiards, you score your cannon as intended, but unfortunately one or both the balls just run slightly in a line with each other, so you have to get the spin on the ball so to actually cannon your opponent's white or the red ball very thinly, and the masse takes effect, so you can really go almost round a corner to cannon the other ball if they're in almost a straight line.
And again, Pearwood, almost every Mannix you see, there are exceptions in ash shafted ones and maple shafted ones, but Mannix believed that the smoothness that you could get on Pearwood really did promote this delicacy of touch, and it allowed the cue to work really well with the type of shots that we've been describing.
Yeah, he designed this cue with a longer butt and different timbers in it, and he thought that Pearwood would have a better feel for the shot that it was intended to play, which was a masse shot.
Yeah.
And Burroughes honoured that basically by making probably, oh goodness me, 8 or 9 out of 10 Mannix you'd see would be still Pearwood.
Most definitely.
But as you alluded to, you could get ash Mannix and maple ones too, which are obviously more scarce.
But they're nearly always latter end Mannix that you get in ash and maple.
Absolutely. I mean, the ferrule of which the Mannix is actually about 3/4 of an inch long, in like a white cow horn, which Burroughes used to buy from France.
Right.
But from the 50s, the mid-50s onwards, the horn ferrule was replaced by black ribbon fibre. So the later Mannix with the Pearwood shaft and normally the mahogany front splice would have a black horn ferrule.
Absolutely.
Not a horn ferrule, sorry, fibre ferrule, black fibre ferrule.
And of course the yield ash cue.
Well, that was the cue aristocrat as Burroughes and Watts described it in their billiards teasers. And funny
Just
enough,
to explain the billiards teasers. What are they?
oh yes, well they were sort of small magazines that just gave a range of the Burroughes and Watts products that you could purchase, and they were printed in their thousands basically, and sent to clubs all over the country, all over the world actually probably. Certainly the clubs at Burroughes had done work on the tables in their supply a few of the teasers, so for the members and the club owners to to purchase Burroughes and Watts products. But the old ash cue, the Yale old ash cue, originally was built as Burroughes and Watts described from 50-year-old ash from the shipyards, Her Majesty's shipyards, and well, it's interesting because it seems to me that some of the ash in the very first edition of the Yale ash cue was probably out at sea at some point, because as we call it salty ash, don't we? It's a reddish brown colour, and it's very soft quite often to play with, but it's not like an ordinary old ash cue. It has a very, very bronzy orangey colour, almost like a Pearwood colour.
It does indeed, and those cues, often the butts look quite dark.
Yeah, very, very dark.
Yeah, very dark butts, and again the semi-rectangular, more rectangular rather than fluted shaped badge that you often get on those. I mean, my Yield ash cue is a second edition, and I do believe it's one of the brightest in terms of the colour of the book of any Yield ash cue that I've ever seen.
Yeah.
It's unusual. I mean, I've had a lot of comments about it, and I got that from London. Would you believe it? It actually came up north from London, and I must admit I have never seen one that I've actually liked better. I've seen several. I mean, you've had a couple that were stunning, and a very long, lengthy one, about 59, 60 inches long.
59 inches. Yeah. Very interesting. And I had one that was only 56 inches with a shorter butt section.
Right. Let's just clarify that point. I think it had the original ferrule,
Yeah.
the original taper and a short butt.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt that queue was built to be that length.
Absolutely. So it had what we call a pigeon ferrule,
Yeah.
Burroughes and Watts used, which is not much thicker than your fingernail really, and sort of, I don't know, heat pressed on or something like that. But they stood the test of time very well. But obviously, if it was an 11mm ferrule size and you wanted a queue that was 10.5, you wouldn't be able to take that ferrule down because it's too thin to do that with. But I believe that queue's in Australia now, but it only had a butt length of a total of, I think, 16.5 inches.
Yeah.
Whereas normally you'd expect to see an 18.5 inch
Oh yes.
butt section in total on the old ash queues.
And that queue reminded me very much of the Willie Smith Champion queues, which you often see again, which are 56.5 there.
Absolutely.
Very common in that length.
Yeah.
Which takes us back really full circle, I guess, to the innovations that Burroughes brought into queue making, and Mannix and all that, and the Eureka, especially designed for snooker. And one of the things that they brought in was the name player, what I call named player queues, i.e. queues that have the name Burroughes and Watts on them, but also have the name of a famous player of the era. And these queues help us date other queues that are similar by the same company. And one of my favourites is the Tom Newman. For many years I had a great soft spot for Tom Newman queues, and such as the 1274, which is refers to a break that he made, 1370 queues, again always made by Burroughes or Peredan. And people say, is it a Burroughes or is it a Peredan? And our rule of thumb, I think we alluded to this in a previous little programme, was if it doesn't say Burroughes and Watts on it somewhere, it probably isn't a Burroughes and Watts.
Yeah. And another thing that Burroughes did, if it didn't say if it was a Burroughes and Watts queue and it didn't say Burroughes and Watts on the nameplate, it would always have the Burroughes and Watts logo stamp on the flat of the queue above the badge.
Yeah. So if in doubt and it's not there, it ain't a Burroughes and Watts.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, that's a good point to make actually. But I mean, talking about Tom Newman, I mean the Burroughes and Watts Tom Newman queues were made of Macassar ebony. That was quite dark normally. Macassar ebony, when it's oiled and it's had a lot of the sweat from your hands and it's been played with over a number of years, can go very dark. In fact, Steve Davis' own queue, which is the old ash queue, you'd think it was jet black ebony butted, but it isn't. It is actually Macassar ebony if you look very closely.
Yes, now I have a Tom Newman queue from a similar era. That is the diagonal signature one, which is very like Steve Davis's queue. Because I was fortunate once to have a very close up look at Steve's queue, and the butt is almost identical. Obviously mine is untouched and single piece and original and everything like that, but it's incredibly dark. But I do believe that's still a piece of Macassar.
Yeah. Or Coromandel, it's difficult. It's actually, the reason I mention this is Coromandel, which I believe was a region in India where the finest cuts of Macassar ebony came from. It's the same species of timber, but it has the most beautiful grain pattern within it. You can't buy that timber anymore. It appears in old travelling cases and other fine pieces of furniture from the Victorian period or the 20s. But it was just the most splendid cut of the Macassar ebony, but it's the same species of timber. So you do see some variance in the grain patterns in these woods, but it's always Macassar ebony of one or two varieties, yeah.
So to sum up, Burroughes and Watts, a very interesting company, quite a long history, very famous for making some specific cues for playing the game of snooker, and what we call named player cues, record break cues, their own brand of cues, their own, for example, the registration number on the Burwood Champion gets a lot of interest. The JP Mannix cues, very interesting company. Yeah,
absolutely. Many other interesting companies, but I mean, I think Burroughes and Watts will always be, as time goes on, it seems to be that it is they that
strike a chord.
Yeah, and are possibly the most collectible of companies. For people who want to start out, a Burroughes and Watts queue is something to treasure really. They advertised their queues as such, items of treasure. And they really did do very well with their advertising to become the most sort of eminent maker. Even though they weren't the oldest company, they were certainly the best known.
Well, thank you very much, Dominic. A subject very close to my heart, the Burroughes and Watts range of cues. Your insights, as always, bring another dimension to what we cover on our programmes. So thank you very much for your time. I've enjoyed that very much. It's reminds me of a few cues that we've shared because you've owned them and they've come to me and what have you. And certainly cues that were made famous by players that we both admire. So thank you very much.
Pleasure, Dave. Thank you. Nice to do this video for you.